You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. This week, we'll talk about homeschooling. More families are discovering it in these difficult days. For others, of course, it's both the old and new normal. Pat Carmack, president of the Angelicum Academy, is our special guest. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Pat, could you start off by telling us a bit about the Angelicum Academy? It's been here for quite some time.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, we started it in 2000, and it was in reaction, really the founders of it, of which I'm one, all had a lot of children at that time. I think collectively we had 17 children, the three of us. And the academic opportunities in each of our states, I was in Oklahoma at the time, and the others were in other states, were very limited and insufficient. So we said, well, we looked at the other homeschooling programs out there. There were very few at the time, and we decided we wanted to do something a little different. So we got a hold of John Sr., who's well known to a lot of educational reformers.
And a hero of Mario Ramos Reyes.
Oh, great. Well, and he and Dr. Dennis Quinn and Frank Nellick, started the Integrated Humanities program at the University of Kansas back in the 70s. And it was tremendously successful. It was a liberal arts great books approach. And so we started there because it was in our area and we were familiar with it. And got in touch real quickly. The antecedents of that program really went back to Mortimer Adler. And Adler was still alive. He passed away in 2001, but we spent time with him in Maryland in 1999 and then in San Mateo, California, where he lived in 2000. And he suggested that there was plenty of reform material to introduce into the homeschool movement, which we did. And interestingly, he converted that year. He was born a non-observant into a non-observant Jewish family, but he read the Summa at age 22 and was intellectually Catholic from that point forward. But he didn't convert till he was 97, like Constantine, I suppose. Anyway, he had three principal insights that we wanted to introduce into the homeschooling movement. One of them was to put the great books, the great classics of Western civilization, center stage, to restore them. That's where they had been from the Middle Ages up till about the late 1800s. And then to do it using the dialectical approach, which is generally referred to as the Socratic method from the Platonic dialogues of where Socrates engaged in a conversational approach to education. And lastly, to restore this form of study to the right age group, and that was high school, secondary education. And a lot of people don't know this, but in the Middle Ages, students typically matriculated at Oxford, the University of Oxford, and the University of Paris at age 14. And they generally would obtain their master's degree, their BA in a year or two, and their master's degree by age 19. And it was found back then, obviously, as we know from history, that the scholars were quite able to deal with profound ideas and to utilize the great books as their main text rather than textbooks. And so that's what we wanted to, pardon me, I have a bit of a cough, I apologize. We wanted to reintroduce those educational insights per Adler into the homeschooling movement. So we began that in 2000. And by the way, Jacques Maritain, the famous Catholic philosopher who was a friend of Adler's, agreed with him on all those points. And that's one that can be found in his book Crossroads, Education at the Crossroads. So we began the first year right out of the chute with from nursery through 12th grade, all subjects, and it was flexible. So what had happened previously in homeschooling was most of the programs came from a brick and mortar school, usually a private one that existed somewhere. And they basically took that curriculum and schedule and so forth and just put it online or put it in a correspondence form initially. But we adopted a more flexible approach because it was for home education. And homeschooling really being a misnomer because we were trying to avoid school and mass education. And so our students can do different grade levels at different paces. So we may have a student in 4th grade math, 5th grade history, 6th grade English, whatever works for them at whatever pace. But anyway, that's how we began it, and it's grown every year. So this is our 21st academic year. And we've had students on 6 continents and I think every state, probably 40 some odd countries. So it's grown quite a lot, and we have quite a few moderators, most of whom are joining us in an adjunct manner, so they'll join the class online. In fact, no two of us live in the same city. None of our faculty, so it's really in cyberspace. So that's the origin of it.
Now, you have a connection with Holy Apostles College. How does that work?
Well, we were looking for a college that would help facilitate the third point I mentioned, which is doing college-level work in high school and getting it recognized. And we had two college professors who found out about our Great Books program from students who contacted us and said, look, you got to get your courses recognized somehow for college credit, because colleges are reluctant to stick their neck out and approve for college credit things done in high school. They like a third party to certify it. So there's a couple of entities in the U.S. that do that. One of them's AP, of course, but they create their own courses. The other one is ACE, the American Council on Education, and they review courses to recommend college credit to their members. They have about 1,600 colleges and universities that are members, and many others follow their recommendations. So we began a search to find a college that would would accept them for credit, and we've actually found quite a few. In fact, there's so many that we had to quit doing it because, with 4,500 colleges and universities in the U.S., it's too many. I'd need several lifetimes to follow up on them all. So we wanted to find ones that we liked. We wanted to find an Orthodox college, one that had some flexibility and that didn't really have a Great Books program, because if they already had one, then we were looking at duplication. And also, generally speaking, colleges and universities that have some form of Great Books program, and there's about 100 of them that do, though most are truncated down to 2 years instead of 4. They tend to view their programs as, the proper way to do it, and they were reluctant to accept anything done in high school, despite the history of it, as I mentioned. So anyway, we Father Joseph Fessio, who's a very good friend of ours, the founder of Ignatius Press, and also Dr. Peter Redpath, he was one of our very first instructors, moderators.
He's been a guest on the Open Door before as well.
Yeah, he's a brilliant philosopher. He now lives in Cave Creek, Arizona. But anyway, they put us in touch with Father Douglas Mosey and Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud at Holy Apostles, who were open to the idea, understood it. We had the American Council on Education review the courses. They've done it twice, recommended them for college credit. So they recommended the course, the Great Books programs, for 6 credits per semester of our students who do it for 4 years, which is 48 credits total, which is about a year and a half of college credit, which was the most they'd ever recommended for any program. And so anyway, Holy Apostles, among others, Benedictine College accepts the credits, Catholic Distance, Campion, I could go on, the list is on our website, but Holy Apostles was the most open to it, the most flexible, and agreed with Adler's and Jacques Maritone's position about doing this in high school. So we began, that was in 2013, we entered into an agreement. So many of our students have been, when they leave us, they go to Holy Apostles, and so that was the connection. And they can take our credits with them. They're accepted by virtue of an agreement. It's a contract, essentially. And so all of the credits are accepted. So our students can go to Holy Apostles after leaving high school with us with up to 75 credits, because we also offer Father Fessio's Theology Online, which is 12 credits. And they're allowed to take 15 credits at Holy Apostles while they're with us, so that totals to 75.
Gosh, that's a chunk. Now, I'm going to ask Christopher Zender to jump in here, because he's done so much with homeschooling and writing textbooks as well for Catholic students. Christopher, tell us how all of this works from your point of view.
Well, we've always developed our own curriculum for our own family. We've been doing homeschooling for about 30 years, so we have a little bit of experience with it. And we've been part of a lot of large homeschooling groups. But yeah, so we find homeschooling to be challenging, and we found homeschooling to be good, rewarding in many ways. It's not for the faint of heart, I would think. And that's why, lead me to want to ask a question is, I've known a wide variety of homeschooling families, and some are very successful at what they do, others seem less successful at what they do. Are there those to whom you would recommend homeschooling, and those who you advise against homeschooling?
Yes, but principally we simply give them all the information, the parents, because we're very parent-directed. The whole thing's based on the Catholic notion that, parents are the principal educators, and they really have the right to make the decisions. So we're very open to whatever they want to do. But there's definitely people for whom it's not a good idea. For instance, and you can't really typically, unless you have relatives that are available, can't leave their children at home all day, even with a babysitter or something of that kind. There's also kids who, they're simply, they get cabin fever, and if there's not sufficient support activities in the area, like, there's homeschool co-ops in many cities now. That's been a part of the movement that's grown a lot. So they can provide sports and music and all kinds of things, foreign languages, and they meet anywhere from 1 day to 5 days a week, and they socialize. But some kids really need more than that, especially if it's a single child or maybe there's only 2 in the family. Larger families tend not to need that as much, and so they find homeschooling generally something more amenable to their situation. But apart from those sort of loose, generic statements. It's really very individual, and there's a lot of it has to do with family dynamics. Some kids are very attached to their parents, and they enjoy being with them the whole day, and that's probably the case in most families. But in some others, that's not the case for a variety of reasons. So we don't push it on anyone. We do find, I would say this, the great majority that begin homeschooling stay in it and appreciate it, at least up to some point where they feel the academic demands may exceed their experience, although that rarely happens in high school. And, for instance, in our program, we have, our faculty, they have access to, I don't know how many we have. I think we have about 15 faculty members, and most of them are PhDs. So there's plenty of academic support. But if they're in some area that, they want to specialize in, and they know that early, then they may want to find, an additional course somewhere. And that kind of flexibility we also recognize, and that helps them to allow them to take different courses in other programs. We don't insist at all that they do all of their work with us. You mentioned you did it in a kind of an eclectic fashion. That's true of a lot of homeschoolers. So in our case, if they wish to take one course with us and nothing else, that's perfectly fine. If they want to do everything with us, that's fine. So the flexibility helps make it work for more families.
Right. I think you're right. It's important to point out that there are actually avenues that homeschooling families can use. For instance, my 17-year-old has taken an interest in diesel mechanics. He wants to become a diesel mechanic. It's the first non-academic orientation in our family, but there's a program through our county in Ohio, Licking County, Ohio, where he can do that and still be homeschooled. So they accommodate that sort of thing. I think that perhaps a lot of parents don't know that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's amazing the amount of support that exists in most cities now. I mean, homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. So then the question is, well, the school districts. There's about 3,500 school districts in the U.S. and they vary. Generally they set their own policies. And 20 years ago, they were hostile to homeschooling. Actually, prior to about 1999, which was Columbine, the tragedy in Columbine, Denver. Prior to that, many of them were hostile to homeschooling, and they didn't want kids to leave their system, and so they wouldn't let homeschoolers utilize anything at the school, even though it was paid for by taxpayers. After Columbine, that began changing fairly rapidly. So most school districts will now allow homeschoolers to participate in some activities. Some of them are very generous, but so they may participate in band, they may participate in sports activities, field trips, all kinds of things. So you just have to check with your local school district. And some of them have homeschool days. A lot of museums do that, so homeschool students get in free that day. And Googling helps. And then the co-ops connect families with information of that sort in their area, so that if a parent's really resolved in most areas in the U.S., they can get all kinds of support for a variety of activities to help them with their homeschooling.
If I may add one more thing, is that I think, too, a lot of parents, it's good that they maybe you deal with this, the legal aspects. We homeschool in California for most of our children, and California has actually pretty liberal laws when it comes to homeschooling. You just have to file a private school affidavit. Here in Ohio, where we live now, there's two ways of doing it. You can either go through the school district, where you have to meet with a teacher, or if you have at least a bachelor's degree, you can actually establish your own independent school. So I think it's one of the things that it's important for people who are out there listening who may be thinking of homeschooling to look into.
Yeah, I'll plug a website. We don't have any connection to it, but they do a great job providing legal information on homeschooling. It's hslda.org. That's the Homeschool Legal Defense Association.org, and you can click on your state and read the current status of the homeschooling law, and if there's any issues going on in that state, like legislation proposed that either helps or hurts homeschooling and so forth.
Could you just give us that information one more time?
Sure, it's HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association.org, and there's a map there that anybody who visits will see, and you can click on your state, and it'll give you the current state of the law. It's a body of attorneys they have that help defend homeschoolers if they ever have any problems. That happened fairly frequently, again, about 20 years ago and earlier. More recently, it almost never happens. Homeschooling is so widely accepted that it's anomalous if there's some problem. And it's usually due to, frankly, a busybody neighbor or something like that has a problem with homeschooling. But that's very rare, and they're fairly easily taken care of.
I may add with Homeschool Legal Defense is we're members. I think the fee is like $100 a year, but if you get paid $100 a year, you get unlimited, basically, legal protection. So
yeah, that's right. So that's less and less needed, but on the other hand, if it is needed, then it's a very inexpensive way to deal with a legal problem with a school district or the reason there's a hostility partly is simply financial. The school districts receive X amount of dollars in each state, the per pupil expense, and it ranges from about $5,000 to about $25,000 per student. So they don't like to lose them, and because if they homeschool, that money doesn't go to that school typically. So that's part of the origin of the problem. But homeschooling's now grown so much. Some estimates put it at well over 2 million students, which is over 5% of the student body in the U.S. So the colleges have to consider them, or they'll go bankrupt with a few exceptions. And so and also they just turn out to be better students on average. There's research to establish this now at colleges and universities. So that's another reason they want them.
You're getting down to some big nuts and bolts, and I know Mario, in looking through the questions that we wanted to ask you, had a lot of questions that were very nuts and boltsy and very practical, and I wonder, Mario, if you want to jump in at this point and pose some of your questions.
Well, I was listening to you, Pat, very carefully, and if I understood you well, there is a tendency or an attitude in homeschooling to work with some districts in some activities. Yeah. So the idea, it seems to me, behind that, I don't know exactly, but I'm assuming, is that to integrate these kids into the rest of the students. And if that then is the case, what would be then the difference between homeschooling as such and, let's say, a Catholic or evangelical parochial schools? What would be the difference?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, the difference would depend on the degree of integration. So, if all they did was participate, for instance, in a football team or baseball team, then that's not very significant. That does provide them contact, socially with other students. But that would be, they'd still be, without question, classified as homeschoolers for everything else. And it leaves the parents in charge of their curriculum, how it's presented. They don't have to worry about their religious beliefs being questioned and challenged or even contradicted, as happens frequently in public schools and so forth. Now, and that includes other things like moral issues, like issues regarding sexuality, drug use, all kinds of things like that. But if they are in a hybrid situation where they attend, for instance, this happens, some science labs in schools are open to them, because often homeschoolers don't have, access to a science lab, although there's many kits available as a footnote, and they can do it at home. But if they want to go to a science lab, well, now they're in the school, they're integrated more into it, and they may take other classes as well, foreign language or what have you. And so, but the parents remain I guess the principal distinguishing point would be the parents remain in charge of the situation, so that if, for instance, in science, they began discussing something that was objectionable to the morality of the parents, the morals of the parents, they can yank them from it. They wouldn't be considered truant. So they remain in control. Whereas if the student's entirely in the school system, we've all read about it, and California's got a major problem with the introduction of all kinds of views, like I mentioned, about sexuality. They have, human reproduction, all kinds of things that get into moral issues that contradict Christian values. And the parents then are in a dilemma, because unless they pull the kids out and homeschool, then they have to begin to go to war with the school district, and that can be an incredibly frustrating experience.
So I read the article, the essay or the paper by Professor Bartholet from Harvard. And at one point she argued about what you are saying. Say, well, yes, they are providing the parents the education the kids need and all the and other aspects. But at one point she said, well, there is an ideological component attached to it, which means in many ways, she goes and explains a little bit about that. She said, well, then the parents generally are ideologically committed to isolate the children from the rest of the people, the majority of the culture, and so that they can, she used this term, indoctrinate them in views and values which are different from the culture. In that sense, they are not being educated in living in a pluralistic society. So what do you say about this? How would you meet this objection?
Well, I read the article. It's attracted some attention, fortunately not much beyond the homeschooling movement. It arises out of an extreme feminist mentality and relativist mentality. So for her, you mentioned pluralistic society. For them, that means there is no truth. But in a real pluralistic society, then obviously one has to look at where do we get the plural, and the plural includes a Christian mentality. After all, the largest portion of Americans happen to be Christian, and the largest Christian group is the Catholic Church. And if you look worldwide, the largest religion on earth is Catholicism. So when they say they isolate them, I mean, it sounds like, they've got a little cult in some little, country valley where, they've never heard of society beyond the mountains. And the opposite is the truth. Most human beings accept the notion of truth. They're not relativist. So right away, what she was, Elizabeth Bartholet was talking about was misstating and mischaracterizing the overall social environment we live in. In a pluralistic society, certainly the largest group ought to have a say and ought to be able to present their views. This goes back to all the inherent contradictions in the leftist positions. So relativism says, there is no truth, or your truth's just as good as mine, meaning there is no truth. But they say that as a truth statement, so it's inherently contradictory. So they want you to believe their truth, and it's intolerant. And we don't have to accept that. Our Constitution guarantees our rights. Homeschooling's legal in all 50 states. That's an outlier position, an extreme position. And what it really stems from is, as I mentioned, it's an intolerant position that doesn't want actually to allow other people to have the freedom that she would like to exercise and did exercise in writing her article. So we're free to respond to it and contradict it, which is easy to do. So most parents that do want to present their children with the notion of truth and not do it in an inherently contradictory manner, as Dr. Bartholet did, have the opportunity to do so, and homeschooling allows them to do that without interference from people like Dr. Bartholet. So at this point in time, in the United States, homeschooling is more solid than it's ever been. The threats against it are smaller than they've ever been. And quite frankly, we have a Supreme Court that's more supportive of it than it's ever been. So at least in the short term, her view will remain one that is of marginal interest and no practical effect on the political or educational level.
I have just one quick question. Is there anyone teaching homeschooling who is not Catholic, is not Christian?
Yes, there are. In fact, there's a number of programs. Well, first off, let me take up the Christian-Catholic element. The Christians, non-Catholic Christians, really initiated it, the big movement, in the 80s and 90s because of the collapse of morals in the public schools, and also because a lot of them were rather fundamentalist, and they wanted the Bible to be a large part of their education, which wasn't happening in public school anymore. You know, it had been previously. The history of public school and education in the United States included a large Protestant element, which included significant Bible study here and there. It wasn't done formally. But as that collapsed, particularly more fundamentalist Protestant groups began homeschooling, pulling their kids out of school. And it kind of gave it that cachet early on, but gradually that changed as the movement grew. But earlier, before that, there was a program called Calvert, which is secular, and it was for U.S. diplomats and military folks who were overseas, and they needed a correspondence course for their kids if they wanted to have an American-type education. So that origin really preceded even the change I mentioned in the 80s and 90s. Now, other programs began, Catholic programs began in the 80s and 90s. Seton began in the 80s, which is the largest program. And their primary focus was, you know, the 3 R's, doing it properly, and getting the kids out of immoral situations. And but there are, I could mention a whole lot of them. There's Laurel Spring, and there's probably on the order of 40 fairly complete homeschool programs out there, and probably 10 of those would be classified as secular. A few of them have kind of unusual educational approaches that they use, that they promote, and which is sort of their raison d'etre. And but the others would be Christian. There's most religions have there's Muslim homeschooling and so forth, but by far the biggest are Christian. Now the Catholic element in that's probably on the order of 10 to 15%, and it's growing. And the reason that it's a smaller percentage is the parochial school system. You know, there's 1,200 Catholic high schools in the United States, and there are very, very few Protestant schools like that. So naturally, since they don't have the alternative of going to a school of their own denomination, they tended to go into homeschooling more. And contrary-wise, Catholics tended to head to the parochial schools, but those are closing at the rate of 15% a year, and Catholic schools are. So increasingly, Catholic parents do not have that option. And the other problem with it is the price has gone up dramatically. The average price per student in high school is around $15,000 a year. It varies. Like in Nebraska, it's around $2,000, but in other states, it's higher. But so the economics of it are also making Catholic parents consider homeschooling. So they do represent a growing percentage of the homeschooling movement.
You mentioned, and this isn't something that we'd want to spend too much time on, but you mentioned some distinctive approaches. Do you want to say a word about unschooling?
Did you ask? I'm sorry, I missed part of the question. Did you say is unschooling
you
one
had
of them?
mentioned some, I don't know what the exact word was, distinctive approaches to homeschooling. And I wondered if this would be a point in which you might just mention unschooling.
Oh, good point. Yes, that is definitely one of them. The unschooling approach takes the advantages of homeschooling, which families encounter when they begin it. The flexibility, the fact that the kids aren't put in a concrete pillbox all day with the windows closed, as a lot of us, I certainly experienced. And they're more in contact with nature. And then they began to read about paideia, how the Greeks educated their children. And of course the Greeks, reached the pinnacle of the use of human reason without the benefit of revelation. And so their educational system that produced, people like Plato and Aristotle and so on, became something of admiration. In fact, it still is in the classical element of homeschooling. And so they look at that and they go, well, they didn't formally school until after age 7, which is true. But they were in contact with nature. And so they would encourage them to swim, to race, to do all things like that. And that was part of their education. And so the unschooling movement took that and also took it to an extreme. And so the idea is basically let them follow their own interest, follow their own, areas of that they're particularly good at, and let nature take its course, so to speak. Well, there's some benefit to that, especially in the early years. In fact, Mortimer Adler maintained that science prior to 6th grade was largely a waste of time. And what he meant by that was, if you look at the science, and this is a digression just to show by means of example about the unschooling movement. In high school, the typical sciences are biology, chemistry, physics. In 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they'll usually dumb that down a bit, and to introduce the principles, the elements of those courses, and so forth. So at 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they may call it life, earth, physics, physical science, something like that. And that's good. That's important. They learn that.
That's what my daughter teaches, so be careful.
Well, those are worthwhile, and they're very good. But prior to that, if you look at the textbooks as we have, they generally simply are pictures of things the kids could experience if they were permitted to do so. For instance, it may show, how a butterfly comes from a caterpillar and so forth, and they'll have beautiful pictures of that process. But it's far better, I think most people would agree, to actually see a caterpillar, put it in a jar, watch the cocoon made, and then a butterfly come out, which most of us did. And so just being in nature, it's better than a textbook prior to 6th grade. That was Adler's view. Now, not all people can do that. And consequently, in the schools, they use textbooks. But in homeschooling, they are able to do that. And so anyway, unschooling essentially carried all these things to an extreme, and the church has a clear teaching on it, and I can't remember the document, which encyclical it was. It was on Catholic education. I don't remember the title at the moment. And the Pope actually addressed, and I can't tell you the Pope either, but it's if anybody wants to know it, they can contact me, and I'll find it for them. But he addressed unschooling and this whole notion, didn't use the word unschooling, but it was the idea of letting students determine their own education and curriculum and so forth. And he said that's ignoring the effects of original sin. Because, we all have inclinations to be lazy, not to want to really study, to do anything difficult and so on. And so the Pope said, no, that's carrying it all quite too far. But nevertheless, there are elements of it that are good. So I hope that answered that.
Or you could get a young fella interested in mechanics who wanted to take apart his dad's car, but really wasn't up putting it back together.
Absolutely. There's a priest who became a famous mathematician, and he related how when he was a kid he was terrible at math. And one summer he just couldn't get it. And one summer he worked on a railroad at a loading dock, and he had to load up bags of wheat and various other grains. And he had to do it, there's like 100 in a row, and then you go 5 wide and so forth. He had to do it all, arithmetically. And by doing that, by actually physically handling it and seeing it, he became interested in math, and he later on became a world-class mathematician. So there's a real element to actually experiencing these things, and that, by the way, is picked up in various programs. Like another one you asked about a specific thing. Another one's Montessori, and they have their own approach where they use manipulatives a lot and so forth, especially in the younger grades. And so there are various educational approaches that promote homeschooling, and not with a particular religious bent. They're more focused on the pedagogy that they utilize.
Right. Let me ask you two pot-stirring questions. Going back to Professor Bartholet, you suggested that she was something of an outlier, and you pointed out that probably most people would still identify themselves as being Christians, and there ought to be, in a pluralist society, plenty of room for what most people actually think. But someone might say, well, if you were to travel in the circles in which Professor Bartholet travels, you wouldn't find that most people were Christians, although they might say something about having some Christian elements back when they were in grade school, but in terms of their ordinary lives, they're very distant from Christianity, and that might be the case in one formulation around Harvard, and it's certainly the case in Los Angeles where I am, but it's not around the schools so much as that it's around the commodification of culture in which Los Angeles specializes. So suppose somebody says, well, maybe in Oklahoma, and you mentioned coming from Oklahoma, maybe in Oklahoma Christianity is okay, but there are plenty of parts of the country, very influential parts of the country, in which it's not okay, and so that's really what's shaping her perspective. That would be one way of stirring the pot. Another way of stirring the pot would be to say, you suggest that the Greeks reached the absolute apex of reason, and here in Los Angeles, for example, you're just about as apt to see a Buddhist temple as you are a Catholic church, and we have a strong Asian aspect. And I could imagine a Confucian saying, hold on, we in China, well, we're nothing to sneeze at, and it's sometimes not known, but the civil service system in China for decades and decades, and more than that, depended on excellence in poetry. And suppose you get pushback from two different areas then, the kind of academic entertainment circles, and then circles that come from, in particular, I'm thinking, Asian backgrounds. What do you think about that? Anything that you'd say to those folks?
Well, the primary argument against homeschooling, again prior to Columbine, was that it was inferior to public schooling or private schooling. And that argument could be documented by test scores like ACT, SAT, and so forth. After Columbine, the academic argument reversed. At Columbine, at the time of Columbine, the average socioeconomic factors for homeschooling families were lower than the national average. And after Columbine, they became higher. So, for instance, measuring things like the academic achievements of the parents, the number of books in the home, the level of education reached, and all kinds of measures of that sort reversed, and now homeschooling represents the higher achievement levels in education. So the principal argument that people used against it has disappeared. And consequently, it can't be attacked very easily, and it isn't on a secular level, because the secular attacks were essentially based on the allegation that it was academically inferior. So that argument they've now lost. Well, with respect to people like, the Ivy League, environment, in the Ivy League colleges environment, or from a different cultural background like Asians and Americans, so forth, their principal interest generally tends to be, if they have children, they want a good education for their children. And whereas the argument used to be homeschooling can't provide that, now it's homeschooling does provide it, and it provides the best way to achieve academic excellence. So, without respect to their, whatever their cultural influences might be in other areas, when they get to the United States, or when they're in the United States and they realize homeschooling actually offers the best opportunity for the children that they all love. So they love their children as we do, and they want that for them. So the argument now, the academic argument, really is a powerful one to counter them. And so you wind up with the only arguments they really have left. And those, by the way, used to be in court against homeschooling. So if you could show that it was inferior, you had judges all across the country that would make rulings, that made homeschooling difficult. That's all now dissipated. So that's why I say she's kind of an outlier at this point, because her arguments have to be rather esoteric ones, based on silly things like, the parents are trying to separate them and isolate them from society. And as I mentioned earlier, that's simply not true. The article had very little truth in it. And what you saw missing in it really was the educational argument was largely not mentioned, the academic excellence, because they've lost that argument. And that's a wonderful thing. And there's quite a bit of study on that now. And data available on that. So that would be my argument to them is, well, if you love your children, you want them to get a good education, homeschooling is the best way to do it.
But, can I jump in here with a question?
Sure.
If then the academic argument is no longer a good argument in order to counter the homeschooling movement, and because the academic achievement have improved dramatically after Columbine,
yes.
Wouldn't then be the case that the idea of starting this homeschool movement just lost its original goal? In other words, was just academic excellence the goal of starting this movement, or there was something else?
Yeah, it was not academic excellence initially at all. And I think the assumption back around 1980, when it really began to take off, was that it would actually be inferior to public education. So there was a great reluctance to launch the movement on the part of most people, that even began it. The principal concern they had back then, it's hard, we're talking now 40 years ago, the principal concern back then was, the sexual revolution had hit the schools and drugs, and those two things became of great concern to parents. When I went in my high school class, there were 3 kids that we knew of that had ever tried any, marijuana or anything like that, any kind of drug, out of the whole class. 2 years later, they did a study, and nearly 50% had. This was in about 1971 and 2. there was a sea change in the moral environment in the schools in the 70s, and by the 80s it had prompted the initiation of the homeschooling movement. And of course, the sexual revolution was in the late 60s, and then, you know, Roe versus Wade was 73, and so the collapse of sexual morality also happened in that period. So those things launched the homeschool movement. It had nothing to do with academic excellence. So initially, the first programs did not emphasize academic excellence. They just emphasized they'd at least get the basics right. They do the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and the kids would get a solid foundation, and they wouldn't have these moral issues, you know, confronting them on a daily basis. So that was a great question. It really was an academic excellence. Now later on, they discovered gradually that if done well and with higher goals, it actually could do a better job with the academics. And but that didn't really happen until, I've mentioned it several times in this interview, Columbine. That was such a sea change, and the reason for that was prior to that, the media had always been hostile to homeschooling. And so it was already, you know, it had a leftist approach to parental rights and religion and so forth. But at Columbine, that was a shock, and anybody who recalls it may recall it was a drumbeat of news articles and interviews and specials and everything. I forget how many kids were killed in that tragedy in that high school, Columbine High School in Denver. It was quite a few. I don't recall the number, but anyway, it shocked the nation. And the media, because of the sensationalism of it, just gave it this drumbeat for months, literally, and it scared people to death. And that now they had another reason to pull their kids out of school. They didn't want them killed, so it was a safety issue. And the media made it kind of like this virus in a sense. You know, the media has the power to really generate fear, whether it's intended or not. And in the case of Columbine, it did. So homeschooling almost doubled after Columbine, from under 1 million to over 2 million within relatively few years, just a few years. And so anyway, that's and when it was recognized, when you got the mainstream folks homeschooling their kids, then they wanted quality. So that's when the academic element came to the fore. And that's been the case ever since. So ever since, and every program has upgraded to, I'm not aware of any really that haven't. They've been forced by competition now to upgrade their academic offerings. They offer more courses. They're done better. They have better textbooks, like the Catholic Textbook Project's one example. And so the result's been an improvement in the academics. And of course, that's right when we started in 2000, the next year. And right away, our object was to have what's the highest thing you can shoot for, and that was the great books. That's where Adler came in, and that was our approach. And it happened to be timed perfectly. And so homeschooling now offers, in almost every program, a superior approach.
Christopher Zender, you've seen a lot of different programs. What do you say about the strengthening, the academic strengthening of these programs? Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I think there is. I'm of course, thank you for mentioning the Catholic Textbook Project, which I'm the general editor. But yes, I do. I think there is a better understanding of what is required academically of students, and I think a lot of it's through the work of people who have been teachers and headmasters and the like who have gotten involved with the homeschooling movement. So they that expertise, that understanding of the nature of education has done well in helping parents understand what is actually required, what they need to do, and what sorts of things they should study. There are a lot of differences of opinion as to, we touched on, what that excellence entails. I mean, some homeschooling programs are more like brick and mortar schools transferred to the home. Others are more free in terms of letting parents teach, determine what the students learn. But I do think that's true, and I think it's palpably true that homeschooling students are well educated, and they are able to achieve what probably and better in many cases than what students achieve who come from even private schools in many cases. I was curious though, in the whole question of Elizabeth Bartholet and what her opinion is there a deeper problem? I think her assumption is that, and it seems the assumption shared by many in our society, that children do primarily have a direct relationship with the state that goes outside of the parent's authority, almost that the parents are custodians of the children, perhaps the best ones for most cases. They're the custodians, almost functioning as the agents of the state, almost. And so what she's basically evoking is that we, as a political community, have to do something about our children. So isn't the deeper problem with her approach is that it has what would be considered, I think, a contrary position to, say, the Catholic position, a position probably many Protestants hold as well, that the parents are the primary and the first teachers of the children, and that the children actually are related to the state through their families, not directly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's certainly true that that's their position, that the parents are, agents of the state in the raising of the children, and if they're introducing values that aren't secular, so for instance religious values, then it becomes a problem as opposed to a benefit. And that's certainly part of her worldview. It didn't begin with her, obviously. The whole notion of public education in the mid-1800s, with secular leaders like Horace Mann and so forth, they made it quite clear in their writings that they wanted to remove the religious element from education. Well, if you don't believe it, if you were like them and non-believers in any form of revelation, then that makes some sense. On the other hand, if you don't agree with that and you have religious faith, then they become a real challenge and one that has to be dealt with in each generation. And she's one of the representatives of that in our generation. It is true that in other countries, they have succeeded in promoting that kind of view, for instance, in communist China, in communist Vietnam. And in some places that's fading a bit, but it hasn't in those countries. So the more extreme ideologies, Marxist ideologies, control education entirely and exclude the parents from it. And if the parents persist in promoting religious values, they'll sometimes take the children away from the parents, which Christians and almost all religions view with abhorrence, that kind of attack on the family. So, so you're right. The more leftist ideologies view the state as the only way they can destroy the influence of parents and therefore of religion over children. And so it's a very deep problem that society has, that people hold such views. Fortunately, we don't have it. It's not the dominant view presently. It certainly will raise its ugly head later in our lifetimes, no doubt. And one can look at other countries and see where that mindset, even in Western democracies, has interfered with homeschooling. For instance, Ireland recognizes homeschooling in their constitution as a right parents have, yet despite that, their highest court ruled it illegal. So you may not homeschool in Ireland. Can you believe that? Even though it's in their constitution and even though it's a predominantly Catholic country. But of course, the secular view has increased dramatically in recent years. So it's something we have to be aware of, and I think your analysis is correct.
And one can't forget Germany, of course, too, where it's really effectively illegal.
There's certainly a parallel, and this is moving from education to politics. The political liberalism of someone like John Rawls argues that when it comes to legal questions, when it comes to structuring state institutions, there ought not to be any arguments that depend on religious premises. And so what's going on there is an emphasis that gives us what's called pure procedural liberalism. The idea is the only thing of substance is the product of what the procedure brings, and the procedure itself disallows any kind of religious commitment. And I think that has been very, very influential. We can take pride in the successes of the homeschooling movement, and we can be very alert to ongoing challenges to that movement. And Pat Carmack, we want to thank you very much for joining us and for all the work that you've done with the Angelicum Academy. We'll end now, as we always do, with the gospel for today, Wednesday of the 5th week of Easter. And this is from the Gospel of John. Jesus said to his disciples, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He takes away every branch in me that does not bear fruit, and everyone that does, he prunes so that it bears more fruit. You are already pruned because of the word that I spoke to you. Remain in me as I remain in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit on its own unless it remains on the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, because without me you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me will be thrown out like a branch and wither. People will gather them and throw them into a fire, and they will be burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask for whatever you want, and it will be done for you. By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. Come, Lord Jesus, come."
WCATradio.com has a show for every interest: apologetics, theology, moral living, and more. Know Your Faith. Please look up my show, Know Your Faith, by logging into WCATradio.com. Then click on Fridays, and that's where you'll find me. Know Your Faith, a show hosted by me, Robert Madrigal, and we'll see you at the show.
For listening to a production of WCAT Radio, please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.